Hello, world history students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video about the effects of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about how the Industrial Revolution changed Europe specifically. It changed the entire world, but we're going to focus on Europe for this unit, and then we'll talk about the ways that industrialization affected the rest of the world when we get to the next unit. So how did the Industrial Revolution change Europe? Well, for one thing, industrialization led to a huge increase in population. First in Europe and then in the rest of the world. You can see here in this graph that, this class started in 1500. So you can see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you can see how the line begins to spike and how population begins to shoot up. One commonly quoted statistic is that it took until 1900 for the world to reach 1 billion people. And then by the end of the 20th century, we were at like 6 billion people. That is because of industrialization. And one of the main reasons why is because of better medical practices, new ideas in medicine, new innovations in medicine. For example, one example, smallpox was a disease that killed many people in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. And during this time period, Edward Jenner came up with a vaccine for smallpox. He recognized that people who worked, that women usually who were working with dairy cows were coming into contact with cows and coming down with something called cowpox, which was similar to smallpox, but not nearly as bad. And so he started purposefully infecting people with cowpox in order to prevent them from getting smallpox. And this was the first really successful vaccine in Europe, and it was wildly successful and basically eliminated the smallpox as a disease that killed people. Another thing was that before this time period, people literally did not understand that diseases were caused by bacteria. The French scientist Louis Pasteur came up with discovered bacteria, the fact that microbes make us sick, and discovered those things. And, that led to things like the pasteurization of milk, where they heat milk up in order to kill the bacteria in it so that it will be less likely to make you sick. That's why it's called pasteurized milk, Louis Pasteur. So Pasteur, anyway, you can see how those two innovations would lead to a much larger population. Fewer people dying, more people living to adulthood, more people having kids, then those kids, and it just grows exponentially. The population explodes. Because factories were being used to make things that people bought, it meant that those things that people were buying became cheaper, which means that more and more people were able to afford to buy more stuff. And so more and more people owned more belongings, and that made many people feel like they had a higher quality of living. Also, industrialization made transportation a lot easier. Before industrialization, most people never went 25 miles away from the place where they were born. After industrialization, people are able to use railroads and steamships to cross continents and oceans. People are able to go on vacations in places where they don't normally live. They're able to migrate to new countries if they don't like living in the country where they're at. And that's going to radically change the way people live. Also, new kinds of communication. First, with the telegraph, which is able to send messages across long distances. Later, the radio, where people are able to broadcast messages to large groups of people. So industrialization is going to make the world feel a lot smaller than it ever had before. And then finally, finally for this topic, not for the video, because factories required a central location, right? Like everybody has to come to the factory to do the work. That means everybody's going to want to live around the factory. That means factories are going to be built in centralized places with high populations. And by that, I mean cities. Factories are built in cities, everybody moves to the city, and this leads to a migration pattern called urbanization. Urban means city. You probably already know this. People moving to the cities is urbanization. Before industrialization, most people lived in the country working as farmers. After industrialization, most people move to the city, they urbanize, they move to the city and get a job in a factory, which is a very different way of life. Okay, how did industrialization affect European social classes? Well, a lot of industrialists exploited their workers. One example of this is during this time period, during the 19th century, Eli Whitney invented a machine called the cotton gin, which slavery in the Americas, both North and South, was on the way to dying out. And then because of this invention of the cotton gin, which allowed the seeds to be separated more easily from the cotton, it made slavery a lot more profitable. And so enslaved African American laborers were exploited further, longer than they might have been otherwise. Another example of this is child labor, where it was cheaper to pay children to do work than it was to pay adults. And so lots of kids were ending up working in factories and mines for like 12, 14, 15 hours a day, where they were being treated incredibly brutally by the people who ran the factories. A lot of times, the people who ran the factories were like punishing them with like beatings and, not allowing them to have enough time to eat or rest. Really bad working conditions. I said earlier there was a higher standard of living. There was a higher standard of living for some people, but there was also a lot of poverty still. And a lot of these people who worked in these low-wage factory jobs could not afford to have a nice place to live. And so you end up with a lot of people living in crowded tenements or apartment buildings like the one you see pictured here, where you have multiple families living all in like an apartment that should be for one group, for one family. And then slums, like crowded, filthy neighborhoods where there's lots of tenements all crowded in next to each other. So the higher standard of living was only for middle class and up. For poor people, the higher standard of living didn't really materialize. That meant that a lot of people were going to turn to protest in order to try to get better opportunities for themselves, to force factories to treat them better. One way they did that was through labor unions, where workers came together as a group in order to negotiate for better working conditions and to force factories to pay them more and to like not let them work as many hours, not make them work as many hours, and also new political parties where, for example, in Great Britain, you're going to have the formation of what's called the Labour Party, where this is a party that represents the concerns of workers and tries to pass laws in Great Britain that are going to force factories to, pass regulations that force factories to treat people better. Finally, how did industrialization affect the environment? Well, people were not particularly good about making sure that their factories were not polluting the air and the water. A lot of the water around factories was used as a place to dump chemicals and things that were used to make the factory run. And one really interesting example of this is that in the middle of the 19th century, this river, the River Thames, which runs through the capital of Great Britain, London, became so polluted with chemicals from factories and with human waste that during the summer, when it got hot, it made the river smell so bad that the Parliament stopped doing work. The British government couldn't meet and pass laws because the smell from the river was so bad that they couldn't think. The river pollution was so bad that they had to close down Parliament. And then the last thing we'll say is that most of the Industrial Revolution was built on burning fossil fuels to power steam engines. Steam engines were the things that made the factories run. Steam engines were the things that made railroads work. And in order to make steam engines work, you need to burn something in order to heat up water so the water will expand. And the thing that they usually used was coal. And coal releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere when you burn it. Now, so does wood, but when you burn coal, you're burning carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that has been out of the atmosphere for hundreds and thousands of years. When you burn wood, you're burning carbon that was in the atmosphere within the last 100 years, and it's not really a big deal. The Earth can deal with that. But when you burn huge amounts of carbon that were not in the atmosphere for thousands of years, suddenly there's a huge excess amount of carbon in the atmosphere. The atmosphere traps the carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which keeps the sun's heat inside the atmosphere and warms up the planet. Now, I am surely no environmental scientist, but in my simplified social studies teacher way, that is how you explain global warming. Global warming started as part of industrialization, as Europeans, not knowing any better, not realizing that they were damaging the planet to this extent, began burning huge amounts of oil and coal. And that is the reason why we are now dealing with global climate change. So, how did the Industrial Revolution change Europe? I think you have more than enough now to answer that question in 3 to 4 sentences. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you next time.